Captain Harold Watson spreads the translated intercepts across his desk at 8th Air Force Intelligence, Bushy Park, England, January 1943, and reads the same phrase for the third time. The German fighter controller's voice, captured by Y-service monitors and rendered into typed English, carries a quality Watson finds almost amusing. The man sounds bored. He is vectoring Focke-Wulf 190s toward a bomber stream somewhere over Wilhelmshaven, and his instructions have the mechanical cadence of a train dispatcher. Turn to heading 270, altitude 6,000 meters. The bombers will be unescorted. They are always unescorted this deep. Watson knows why the controller sounds bored. Everyone at Bushy Park knows. The math is brutally simple, and the Germans have done it correctly. A Spitfire burns fuel at a rate that gives it combat radius of roughly 175 miles. A P-47, Thunderbolt, the newest American fighter in theater, can push to 300 miles if the pilots are careful and the drop tanks work. From the British coastline to targets in central Germany runs 450 miles, 500 to the industrial cities that matter. The arithmetic means the bombers fly alone for the last 100 miles in and the first 100 miles out, 200 miles of sky where German fighters can form up, make repeated passes, and land to refuel while the bombers keep bleeding. The Luftwaffe calls this zone the Todes Corridor, the Death Corridor. They have staffed it accordingly. By January 1943, Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2 between them field more than 200 single-engine fighters specifically positioned to exploit this gap. The controllers know exactly when American escort will turn back. They watch it happen every mission. They have stopped being surprised. Watson flips to another intercept, this one from a ground station near Bremen. A different controller, same tone. Single-engine escort turning west at the usual point. All units engage at will. The phrase, "the usual point," appears in 4 separate intercepts from the same week. The Germans have not merely identified the gap, they have built their entire defensive system around its existence. Fighter bases cluster in an arc just beyond P-47 range. Ammunition and fuel depots feed those bases with obsessive efficiency. Flak belts thin out precisely where fighters take over, because why waste shells when Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts can do the work more cheaply? The whole architecture assumes American escort cannot reach them. The assumption is not arrogance, it is physics. Fuel capacity multiplied by consumption rate equals range, and single-engine fighters carry limited fuel. Except the British have been flying something that should not exist. In October 1942, the Royal Air Force's Army Cooperation Command received the first examples of a new American fighter called the Mustang, designated P-51 by the Americans, Mustang Mark I by the RAF. The British wanted it for low-altitude reconnaissance because its Allison engine performed poorly at high altitude. Nobody in England thought of it as an escort fighter, but an RAF test pilot named Ronald Harker flew one in April 1942 and noticed something that did not match the tactical role. The airplane carried 180 gallons internally. It burned fuel at a rate substantially lower than a Spitfire. When Harker did the math, he got a combat radius exceeding 400 miles on internal fuel alone. Add drop tanks, and the number climbed towards 600. Nobody had asked for this. The airframe was designed by North American Aviation in Los Angeles, built to a British Purchasing Commission requirement for a fighter at least as good as the Spitfire. The British thought they were getting a licensed copy of an existing American design. What showed up was an original aircraft with laminar-flow wings and internal fuel capacity that engineers in Germany would have called impossible for a single-engine fighter. The British asked for a Spitfire equivalent and got a machine that could fly to Berlin and back with fuel to spare for combat over the target. American industrial capacity and engineering audacity would produce an aircraft that erased the entire defensive concept the Luftwaffe had spent 2 years building. The Germans designed their air defense around a law of physics they believed unbreakable. American engineers broke it anyway. If you know a detail about the Mustang's development that deserves more attention, the wind tunnel work, the radiator placement, the men who flew the early tests, put it in the comments. A like and a subscribe keep this channel telling these stories. Watson does not know any of this yet. In January 1943, the P-51 exists only as a low-altitude tactical aircraft with a wrong engine, and nobody at 8th Air Force has connected its fuel capacity to the escort problem. That connection will come. Rolls-Royce engineers are already working on mating a Merlin 61 engine to the Mustang airframe, a modification that will give the aircraft high-altitude performance to match its extraordinary range. The prototype will fly in October 1943. By December, the first Merlin-powered Mustangs will arrive in England designated P-51B. And in March 1944, when the first American fighters appear over Berlin, not P-47s on a one-way suicide run, but Mustangs with full tanks and ammunition to spare, the German controller's voice on the intercepts will carry a different tone entirely. The boredom will be gone. What replaces it is confusion, then silence, as the monitoring stations record controllers who simply stop transmitting. The contract sits in the National Archives now, folder number unclear, but the key clause survives in North American Aviation's corporate records. Dated April 1940, it specifies delivery of the first prototype within 120 days of contract signature, 4 months, to design and build an entirely new fighter aircraft from a blank sheet of paper and fly it. The British delegation that signed this document either believed they were dealing with madmen or had run out of options. Both things were true. The story begins in January 1940, when the British Purchasing Commission crossed the Atlantic with authorization to spend money at a rate that alarmed even the Treasury. France was still in the war. The Low Countries remained neutral. Poland was gone, but Britain itself had not been bombed. What the Commission understood, which the American public did not yet grasp, was that the Royal Air Force would run out of fighters before the Luftwaffe ran out of pilots unless someone started building aircraft faster than British factories could manage. The obvious solution was American production. The obvious aircraft was the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, in production, tested, proven capable of meeting minimum RAF requirements. The Commission's leader, Sir Henry Self, had authorization to purchase as many as the Americans could build. He did not have authorization to take risks. Self's team arrived at North American Aviation's facility in Inglewood, California, in late March. North American was not their primary target. The company had no fighter in production. Their main product was the AT-6 Texan trainer, a perfectly competent aircraft that taught pilots how to fly before sending them into combat machines built by someone else. North American had never delivered a single fighter to any air force. Their chief designer, Edgar Schmood, was a German émigré who had worked for Fokker in the Netherlands before immigrating in 1930. Their president, James Howard Kindleberger, known universally as Dutch, was 44 years old and had spent most of his career at Douglas Aircraft before taking over a company that seemed destined to remain a second-tier supplier. The commission wanted to discuss subcontracting. Could North American tool up to build P-40s under license from Curtiss? Dutch Kindleberger said no. Not no, we cannot do it. Not no, we lack the capacity. He said no, we will not build someone else's airplane when we can build you a better one. The P-40, he told the British delegation, was already obsolete. Its liquid-cooled Allison engine would never perform adequately at high altitude. Its range was limited. Its design dated to 1937, an eternity in aviation development. Give us the same engine and the same armament requirements, Kindleberger proposed, and we will design you something superior. We will do it in 4 months. The commission members exchanged glances. 4 months was not realistic. The P-40 had taken Curtiss 2 years from concept to first flight. Kindleberger was either lying or delusional. But the commission was running out of options, and North American was offering to absorb the development costs. If the prototype failed, Britain lost nothing but time. If it worked, they would have something the P-40 could never become. Edgar Schmood had already been thinking about fighters. He had sketched airfoil shapes in his spare time, following a quiet revolution happening in aerodynamic research. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, had published data on laminar-flow wing sections, theoretical designs that promised lower drag than any conventional airfoil. Nobody had built a production aircraft using them. The manufacturing tolerances were brutal. Any imperfection in the wing surface, a rivet head, a seam, a dent, would trip the laminar flow into turbulence and eliminate the advantage. Schmood thought it was worth trying anyway. The potential reward was a fighter that slipped through the air more efficiently than anything flying. That efficiency would translate directly into range, more miles per gallon, longer time over the target, greater distance from base to combat and back. The British wanted a Spitfire equivalent. Schmood intended to give them something the Spitfire's designers at Supermarine had never attempted. The internal fuel capacity would be massive for a single-engine fighter, 180 gallons standard, with provisions for more. The radiator would mount in a ventral scoop behind the cockpit, positioned so that the heated air exiting the system would provide a small but measurable thrust boost. The Meredith effect, named for the British engineer who had calculated it theoretically. Nobody had optimized it in a production aircraft. Schmood would try. The contract was signed in late April 1940. First flight was required by September. 117 days later, on October 26, 1940, a silver prototype designated NA-73X rolled onto the runway at Mines Field in Los Angeles. It had no engine cowling. The Allison had arrived late, and the team had bolted it in without fairings, just to meet the deadline. Test pilot Vance Breese opened the throttle. The aircraft lifted off the runway and climbed into California sunshine. It handled beautifully. The laminar flow wings worked. The airframe was everything Schmood had promised. The British got their Spitfire equivalent. What they actually received was an aircraft that would outlast the Spitfire, outrange it, outproduce it, and eventually escort bombers to targets the Spitfire's designers never imagined reaching. Dutch Kindleberger's arrogance, his refusal to build someone else's obsolete design, created the weapon that would break the Luftwaffe's air defense system. The Germans had no equivalent response because no German company had made the same gamble. 78 engineers. That was Schmood's entire design team when the contract landed in late April 1940. 78 men to produce complete blueprints for a fighter aircraft in time for manufacturing to begin, tooling to be fabricated, parts to be machined, and a flyable prototype to roll out before the deadline expired. The British had given them 120 days. Schmood looked at the calendar and started counting backward from the required first flight date. Subtract time for ground testing. Subtract time for engine installation. Subtract time for final assembly. Subtract time for parts fabrication. What remained for design was closer to 60 days, maybe less if anything went wrong. Everything went wrong. The Allison V1710 engine that would power the prototype existed only on paper when Schmood's team started drawing the airframe around it. General Motors was still sorting out production problems at their Indianapolis plant. The specification sheets kept changing. Weight estimates revised upward. Accessory locations shifted. Propeller shaft dimensions corrected. Every change rippled through Schmood's drawings. The wing root had to accommodate the engine mount. The fuselage cross-section had to clear the supercharger intake. The firewall position depended on the exact length of the power plant, and that length remained uncertain for weeks. Schmood's solution was to design in parallel streams, accepting that some work would be thrown away. Teams drew multiple versions of interfacing components. When the engine specs finally stabilized, they picked the drawings that fit and discarded the rest. The waste was enormous. The alternative was missing the deadline. British aluminum suppliers had committed material based on the contract timeline. Subcontractors had scheduled their machine tools. The entire production chain depended on North American delivering drawings on schedule, and the drawings depended on an engine that kept changing shape. The laminar-flow wing created its own problems. NACA's theoretical data promised reduced drag, but translating theory into metal required surface tolerances that American aircraft factories had never attempted. A conventional wing could hide imperfections under paint. Schmood's wing demanded smoothness measured in thousandths of an inch. The manufacturing team built test sections, measured them, found the surfaces too rough, and started over. They experimented with different riveting patterns. Flush rivets set below the skin surface, then filled and sanded smooth. The process added hours to every wing panel. Schmood refused to compromise. The whole point of the aircraft was efficiency. Sacrifice the wing quality, and you sacrifice the range that made the design worth building. The workers learned to sand aluminum the way furniture makers sanded hardwood. They developed a feel for surface quality that no instrument could fully capture. Touch told them when a panel was ready. The skill did not exist in American aviation 6 months earlier. North American invented it because the alternative was admitting Kindleberger had promised something impossible. The fuselage fuel tank nearly killed the project. Schmood wanted 180 gallons internal capacity, far more than any single-engine fighter in production. The only way to fit that much fuel was a tank behind the pilot's seat, running from the cockpit floor almost to the vertical stabilizer. Structural engineers calculated the weight. With full fuel, the aircraft's center of gravity would shift dangerously far aft. The handling characteristics might become unflyable. Schmood accepted the risk. Pilots would simply have to burn down the rear tank first, before engaging in combat. The fuel quantity mattered more than perfect handling at gross weight. Later versions would add a fuselage tank ahead of the cockpit to improve the balance, but the prototype carried its fuel where Schmood put it, behind the pilot, creating handling quirks that test pilots learned to manage because nobody had time to redesign the airframe. The engine arrived late. Allison shipped the V-1710 to Inglewood in early October, weeks behind the original schedule. The prototype airframe sat complete, except for the nose section, waiting. When the engine finally reached the factory floor, mechanics worked in continuous shifts to install it. They bolted the power plant to the mount, connected fuel lines, wired the electrical systems, attached the propeller. The cowling panels that should have covered the engine installation were not ready. Sheet metal workers were still forming them when the calendar hit October 26th. Vance Breese climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft that looked half-finished, its engine nacelle a mess of exposed accessories and unfinished fairings. The British contract specified a flyable prototype in 120 days. North American had used 102, 18 days early, despite every obstacle Allison and physics had thrown at them. Breeze taxied to the runway at Mines Field, the airport that would later become Los Angeles International, and ran through his checklist. The Allison idled roughly. The airframe vibrated with frequencies nobody had characterized yet. No wind tunnel model of this exact configuration existed. NACA had tested the laminar-flow airfoil in isolation, not installed on a complete aircraft with a real engine and real control surfaces. Breeze was about to discover whether Schmood's calculations matched reality. He advanced the throttle. The Mustang accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air, climbing smoothly, responding to control inputs with precision that surprised even the men who had designed it. 102 days from blank paper to flight. The British had asked for a P-40 equivalent and watched an American company deliver something unprecedented, something that existed because 78 engineers refused to accept the constraints everyone else treated as fixed. Why did 78 engineers in California instinctively design an aircraft with twice the range of contemporary British fighters? The answer has nothing to do with foresight about escort missions over Germany. In 1940, nobody at North American Aviation was thinking about Berlin. They were thinking about California. The United States spans 3,000 miles from coast to coast. When American military planners looked at maps, they saw a country where reinforcing one coastline from the other required crossing a continent. A fighter built in Los Angeles might need to fly to New York. An aircraft manufactured in Buffalo might deploy to Seattle. The Panama Canal, the strategic choke point that connected two oceans, sat 2,000 miles from the nearest American airbase. American aviation developed around the assumption that aircraft would routinely fly distances that European designers considered absurd. The Douglas DC-3, which entered service in 1936, carried passengers from New York to Los Angeles with only 3 refueling stops. American Airlines demanded range because American geography demanded range. The engineers who designed commercial aircraft in the 1930s carried those assumptions into military work. British aviation evolved under different pressures. The entire United Kingdom fits inside an area smaller than Oregon. RAF fighters defended an island where no point lay more than 70 miles from the sea. The critical design requirement was climb rate. How quickly could a Spitfire reach altitude to intercept incoming bombers? Range mattered less because the combat area was always close to home. A Spitfire with 175 miles of combat radius could reach any point over Britain, engage the enemy, and return with fuel to spare. The Hurricane and Spitfire were defensive weapons optimized for a defensive war. They excelled at their intended mission. Nobody at Supermarine or Hawker spent much time worrying about flying to Berlin because nobody expected British fighters to fly to Berlin. That was Bomber Command's job. Fighter Command's job was survival. The Germans made similar assumptions. The Messerschmitt 109 entered service in 1937 with an internal fuel capacity of 88 gallons. Less than half what Schmood would later put in the Mustang. Willy Messerschmitt designed for the mission his Air Force expected to fly: short-range interception and tactical support for ground forces. The Luftwaffe planned to fight over enemy territory, yes, but always within range of captured airfields. Poland fell in weeks. France fell in 6 weeks. The assumption was that German fighters would always operate close to friendly bases because the Wehrmacht would always be advancing. When the advance stopped at the English Channel, the 109's limited range became a crippling liability. German fighters escorting bombers over London had perhaps 10 minutes of combat time before fuel reserves forced them to turn back. The same design philosophy that made the 109 lethal over Spain and Poland made it nearly useless over southern England. Messerschmitt never added significant fuel capacity. The airframe was too small, the design too optimized for other qualities. By the time the Luftwaffe recognized the problem, the solution required an entirely new aircraft. They never built one in time. Edgar Schmood carried American distance assumptions into the Mustang design without anyone ordering him to do so. He made the fuselage longer than necessary for the engine installation, creating space for fuel tanks that British or German designers would have rejected as excessive. He optimized the airframe for cruise efficiency rather than maximum speed in short bursts. The laminar-flow wing reduced drag at the cost of manufacturing complexity, a trade that only made sense if you valued range over ease of production. Every choice pointed toward an aircraft that could fly long distances economically. Schmood built these features into the Mustang because they seemed obvious to an engineer working in Los Angeles, where the nearest potentially hostile coastline lay 2,500 miles to the west. Distance was not a problem to be minimized. It was a fact of life to be accommodated. The British Purchasing Commission did not understand what they were buying. Their specifications mentioned armament, speed, climb rate, ceiling, the standard metrics for evaluating a fighter aircraft. Nobody asked about range because nobody thought to ask. Range was a reconnaissance aircraft concern, a bomber concern, not something that mattered for a single-engine fighter intended to replace the P-40 in tactical roles. When the first Mustangs arrived in England in late 1941, RAF evaluators tested them against Spitfires and found the American aircraft comparable in speed, but slightly slower in climb and heavier in controls. The reports mentioned range only in passing. The Mustang carried more fuel than a Spitfire. Interesting. Not relevant to the intended mission. Ronald Harker changed that equation when he calculated what the fuel capacity actually meant. 400 miles of combat radius on internal fuel, 600 with drop tanks. The numbers did not match any British or German assumption about what single-engine fighters could do. Harker recognized that the Americans had accidentally solved a problem the RAF had not yet formally acknowledged: the problem of escorting bombers beyond the range of existing fighters. He wrote a memo. The memo reached people who could act on it. Rolls-Royce engineers began work on mating a Merlin engine to the Mustang airframe, transforming a low-altitude reconnaissance aircraft into a high-altitude escort fighter. The range was already there. Schmood had built it in without being asked. American geography had taught him that distance mattered, and he designed accordingly. The Mustang with an Allison engine was a disappointment above 15,000 feet. There is no point pretending otherwise. Schmood's aircraft flew 102 days after contract signature and carried more fuel than anything in its class. It gasped for air at combat altitude. The Allison V-1710 used a single-stage supercharger that simply could not force enough oxygen into the cylinders once the air thinned out. At 20,000 feet, where the Luftwaffe and the RAF fought their war, the Mustang's engine produced barely half its rated horsepower. A Spitfire could climb past it. A 109 could dive away from it. The aircraft that Dutch Kindleberger had promised would outperform the P-40 was outperforming the P-40 at altitudes where neither the P-40 nor the Mustang had any business fighting. The British took delivery of their first Mustang Mark Is in late 1941 and immediately assigned them to Army Cooperation Command for low-level reconnaissance, armed reconnaissance over France, tactical photography, missions that stayed below 10,000 feet where the Allison still breathed properly. The aircraft was too good to waste and too limited to use as intended. Ronald Harker flew a Mustang Mark I in April 1942. He was a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, not the RAF, and he approached the aircraft with an engineer's eye rather than a tactician's assumptions. The handling impressed him. The speed at low altitude impressed him more, faster than a Spitfire Mark V at the same height, which should have been impossible given the Mustang's larger fuel load and heavier structure. Harker ran the numbers after landing and realized the laminar-flow wing was doing exactly what NACA's theoretical data had predicted. The drag was lower than any operational fighter he had tested. The airframe was slipping through the air more efficiently than anything the British or Germans had built. Everything about the Mustang suggested a world-class fighter except the engine. Harker knew what engine it needed. Rolls-Royce built the Merlin, and the Merlin used a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power to altitudes where the Allison had already quit. Mate the Merlin to the Mustang airframe, and you would have an aircraft that performed at 25,000 feet, the way the Allison version performed at 5,000. Harker wrote his memo on April 29, 1942. The engineering work started within weeks. The conversion was not simple. The Merlin was heavier than the Allison, with different mounting points and accessory locations. The supercharger intercooler required additional air scoops. The propeller reduction gear sat at a different angle, which meant redesigning the engine mount and nose section. Rolls-Royce engineers worked alongside North American representatives to solve each problem in sequence. The intercooler went into a deeper belly scoop. The engine mount tilted downward to accommodate the propeller shaft angle. The nose section grew slightly longer to cover the bigger power plant. Each modification added weight. Each added weight threatened to shift the center of gravity that Schmood had already pushed to dangerous limits with his rear fuselage fuel tank. The engineers moved systems forward, radio equipment, battery, oil tank, until the balance came back to acceptable ranges. The redesigned aircraft, designated Mustang Mark X by North American and Mustang Mark III by the RAF, first flew in October 1942. The climb rate at 20,000 feet tripled. The maximum speed increased by 50 miles per hour. The critical altitude, the height at which the supercharger could no longer maintain full power, jumped from 15,000 feet to over 30,000. The irony is that Britain gave America back its own aircraft. North American had designed the airframe. NACA had developed the laminar-flow wing theory. American factories had figured out how to manufacture surfaces smooth enough for laminar flow to work. American engineers had built in the fuel capacity that made long-range escort possible. All of that existed before Rolls-Royce touched the aircraft. What Britain contributed was an engine, a brilliant engine, perhaps the best piston aircraft engine of the war, but still just an engine. The Merlin went into Spitfires and Hurricanes, and Lancasters and Mosquitoes. It made all of them excellent. It made the Mustang transformational, because the Mustang already had the range that no other fighter possessed. Put a Merlin in a Spitfire, and you got a better Spitfire. Put a Merlin in a Mustang, and you got an aircraft that could fly from England to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes over the target, and return to base with fuel remaining. No British-designed airframe could do that. No German-designed airframe could do that. California provided the range. American distance assumptions, and Edgar Schmood's decision to make the fuselage longer and the fuel tanks bigger. That was how you built airplanes in a country 3,000 miles wide. Packard began license producing the Merlin as the V-1650 in the United States. American factories that had struggled to make the Allison perform at altitude now manufactured British-designed superchargers with American production techniques. By 1943, North American's Inglewood plant was producing Mustangs, with American-built Merlins faster than the original production line had built Allison-powered versions. The P-51B and P-51C models rolled off the line and crossed the Atlantic in crates, assembled at English depots, and flew into combat with the 8th Air Force. The first escort mission to Berlin occurred on March 4, 1944. 660 heavy bombers, 173 P-51s accompanying them the entire way. Through the German border, past the Ruhr Valley defenses, over the capital, and back out again. The Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept and found American fighters waiting at every altitude. Harker's memo had taken 23 months to become operational reality. The reality exceeded anything he had calculated. The Mustang was not merely competitive with German interceptors at high altitude. It was superior to them, faster in level flight, better in sustained climb, more maneuverable at speeds where the 109's controls grew heavy. The drop tank tumbles end over end, catching morning sunlight as it falls. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke watches it separate from the belly of an aircraft he cannot identify. Single engine, inline nose, silhouette wrong for a Thunderbolt. The tank is made of pressed paper, laminated and sealed, designed to be discarded. Knoke has seen Thunderbolts drop their tanks before. Those tanks are metal, heavy, expensive. The Americans waste aluminum on disposable fuel containers because they have aluminum to waste. This paper tank is something else, cheaper, lighter, made for a different purpose. He counts 9 more tanks falling away from 9 more fighters. The American formation is at 25,000 feet, directly over the bomber stream, 600 miles from the English coast. Knoke's flight has climbed for 18 minutes to reach intercept altitude over Berlin, and the Americans are already there, waiting, as if they had flown from an airfield in Poland rather than from Suffolk. His fuel gauge shows enough for perhaps 30 minutes of combat. The American pilots have just thrown away external tanks that held, what, 75 gallons each? More. They have discarded enough fuel to fly his entire squadron to Munich and back, and they have done it casually, the way a man drops a cigarette butt. The Focke-Wulf 190, ahead of Knoke, waggles its wings and rolls into a diving attack on the B-17 formation below. Knoke follows. The bombers fill his windscreen. Silver aluminum, white contrails, gun turrets tracking his approach. He has done this before. The sequence is familiar. Dive through the defensive fire, close to 300 meters, fire a 2-second burst, roll away before the closure rate becomes suicidal. What is not familiar is the shadow that appears in his peripheral vision, closing from his 7 o'clock position, moving faster than any escort fighter he has encountered. The Mustang's engine note reaches him before he processes what he is seeing. A high-pitched whine, different from the Thunderbolt's radial growl, different from the Allison-powered versions the RAF flew low over France. This sound is a Merlin. Knoke knows the Merlin. He has heard it in Spitfires and fought against it over the Channel. He learned to respect the engine that powers Britain's best interceptors. The Merlin does not belong here. It belongs over Kent and the Pas de Calais, over the short-range defensive perimeter where British fighters have always lived. Berlin is 500 miles beyond any mission a Merlin-powered Spitfire could fly. The aircraft on his tail is not a Spitfire. Knoke breaks right, pulling into a climbing turn that should force the pursuer to overshoot. The Mustang follows him through the turn, maintaining position, its nose tracking his cockpit with a patience that suggests the pilot has fuel to spare. No hurry, no desperate lunge before the tanks run dry. The American has time. Knoke does not. Every second of maneuvering burns fuel he cannot replace, while the American has apparently crossed half of Europe and still carries enough to fight a prolonged engagement. The realization arrives with physical weight. Knoke feels it in his chest, a compression, a tightening, as if the cockpit has suddenly grown smaller. The safe sky is gone. The assumption that German pilots could climb, engage, break contact, and return home before American escorts reached them, that assumption died somewhere over the Ruhr, and nobody told the Luftwaffe it was dying. Every tactical doctrine, every mission planning assumption, every calculation of acceptable loss rates has just become obsolete. The bombers are no longer unescorted. They will never be unescorted again. he dives for the deck. It is the only option left. The Mustang follows for perhaps 2,000 meters, then pulls up and returns to the bomber stream. The American has made a choice: protect the bombers rather than chase a single German fighter into the weeds. That choice reveals doctrine. The escort mission takes priority over individual kills. Canuck is not worth pursuing when there are more 190s climbing toward the formation behind him. Landing at Wunstorf 90 minutes later, Canuck counts aircraft as they roll to their dispersals. 7 of 12 machines that took off that morning, 5 pilots dead or parachuting into captivity somewhere in Brandenburg. The Mustangs had stayed with the bombers for the entire engagement window, picking off fighters as they made their attack runs, punishing every attempt at a coordinated assault. The bomber gunners had seemed almost relaxed. Why wouldn't they be? Their escorts were handling the interception. Noak files his after-action report. An intelligence officer asks about the new American fighter. Range estimates, performance observations, anything useful for the tactical assessments being compiled in Berlin. Noak tells him what he saw: the paper drop tanks, the Merlin engine sound, the way they let him go rather than chase, the patience of pilots who fought as if fuel were unlimited. The officer writes it down without expression. He has heard similar reports from other units that morning. The data is accumulating. By evening, Luftwaffe operations will have a reasonably accurate picture of what happened over the capital. American single-engine fighters operating at ranges previously considered impossible, maintaining air superiority over targets the Reich's defenses had believed were beyond escort reach. The Jagdwaffe's losses for March 4, 1944, totaled 16 fighters destroyed and 11 damaged, 8 pilots killed. The Americans lost 1 bomber to fighters, 1. The exchange rate had been acceptable when German interceptors could choose their engagement windows, strike the bomber stream, and withdraw before escorts arrived. That mathematics no longer functioned. The escorts arrived with the bombers. They stayed with the bombers. They had fuel to spare for the return flight, while German pilots watched their gauges and calculated whether they could reach home. Sir Henry Self signs the final production agreement in Washington on a Tuesday afternoon in September 1944, 4 years and 5 months after the British Purchasing Commission first approached North American Aviation about building P-40s under license. The document authorizes continued American production of P-51D models for RAF service, with deliveries scheduled through 1945 and beyond. Self initials each page with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has signed hundreds of similar agreements. But this one carries a weight, the others do not. The British had come to America asking for a copy of an aircraft Curtiss had already built. They received instead a machine that rendered every European fighter design philosophy obsolete. The counter-offer Dutch Kindleberger made in that first meeting, "Give us 120 days, and we will build you something better," had proven to be the most consequential act of corporate arrogance in aviation history. None of them knew what they were starting. Kindleberger was making a promise he could not guarantee. Schmood was solving a problem no one had properly defined. Harker, writing his memo about mating the Mustang to the Merlin, was describing the aircraft that would make daylight strategic bombing survivable, but he could not have known that either. The knowledge came later. accumulated in after-action reports and loss statistics, and the accumulating silence on German radio frequencies that Captain Harold Watson tracked from his desk at Bushy Park. The Luftwaffe did not announce its own destruction. It simply stopped responding. Controllers who had once vectored fighters with professional calm began issuing orders that went unanswered. Pilots who acknowledged takeoff instructions never reported contact with the bomber stream. The Y-Service monitors recorded the disintegration of German air defense in real time, not as dramatic confessions of defeat, but as expanding gaps in the radio traffic, missions that launched and never returned, units that stopped transmitting altogether. By April 1944, Watson's team was tracking the death of the Luftwaffe through what it could no longer say. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, commanding the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, provided the post-war assessment that American intelligence officers had expected. His Foreign Military Studies interview, conducted in 1945 with the war barely finished, contains the admission that validates every decision North American made. The P-51 was the most difficult opponent we faced, Galland stated. It could escort bombers to any target in Germany and fight effectively when it arrived. We had no adequate response. The words are clinical. A professional fighter pilot evaluating enemy equipment with the detachment his interrogators requested. Galland does not mention the pilots he lost, does not describe what it felt like to watch his command structure collapse as experienced flight leaders died faster than replacements could be trained. The interview format does not accommodate such observations. What survives is the technical judgment. The Mustang outperformed German interceptors at the altitudes and ranges that mattered, and the Luftwaffe could not prevent it from escorting bombers to targets the Reich's air defense system had assumed were unreachable. Galland flew 109s and 190s throughout the war. He knew what his aircraft could do. He knew what the Mustang could do. His assessment is the enemy's acknowledgement that range assumptions, manufacturing capacity, the willingness to build an aircraft from scratch rather than copy someone else's compromise, all of it had combined to produce a weapon his service could not counter. The British had asked for a licensed copy. They got a fighter that broke the safe sky over Berlin. The North American aviation plant at Inglewood sits beneath the flight path of Los Angeles International Airport now, the factory buildings long since demolished and replaced by commercial development. Runway traffic passes overhead every 90 seconds. 737s and A320s carrying passengers who do not know that the ground beneath them once produced 15,000 Mustangs in 3 years. The assembly lines are gone. The stations where workers riveted laminar-flow wingskins to aluminum spars. The receiving bays where Packard built Merlins arrived in crates and left installed in airframes. The production floor. Edgar Schmood walked checking tolerances on aircraft he had designed in 102 days. That space is a parking structure now. Concrete and fluorescent lighting, and the smell of exhaust. Bushy Park, where Watson read his intercepts and tracked the Luftwaffe's collapse through radio silence, returned to public parkland after the war. The huts that housed 8th Air Force intelligence were temporary structures, removed when the Americans went home. Wunstorf, where Heinz Knoke landed with 5 of his squadron missing, operates today as a German Air Force transport base, its runways rebuilt and extended for modern aircraft. The dispersal areas where 190s and 109s waited between missions have been paved over, grassed over, absorbed into the expanded infrastructure of a peacetime military installation. The men who flew from those fields, American, British, German, are nearly all gone now. Their testimonies preserved in archives and interview transcripts and the dry prose of official histories. What remains is the aircraft itself, restored Mustangs in museums from Dayton to Duxford, polished aluminum reflecting gallery lighting, placards explaining range and speed and armament to visitors who have never heard a Merlin at full power. The sound is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. A sustained mechanical roar, high-pitched and smooth, carrying for miles across open ground. Pilots who flew Mustangs in combat said the engine note was the last thing German interceptors heard before the 50 calibers opened up. The first thing, usually, was silence. The safe sky had ended. The Americans had arrived.